Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Yeah, great. My name is Aadesh Gawde. I'm a principal with ProVise. So why I'm here today? I'm not going to talk about PCI DSS. I'm not a PCI DSS expert. Okay. I'm going to walk you through in these next 30 minutes about how we on the floor at the Security Operations Center manage compliance for PCI DSS as well as other frameworks. Okay? And we strongly believe that compliance is something that shouldn't work for. It should be just a byproduct of doing things right. So next 30 minutes, I'm going to walk you through, I'm going to take the 12 requirements, and then map it to how continuous compliance monitoring and compliance automation is being done. Okay, so as I mentioned, a short story here. So in 1961, JFK, when he visited NASA, he spotted a janitor cleaning, and he asked, "What are you doing?" The janitor promptly replied, "I am sending a man to the moon." There's a purpose there. There's a vision. The janitor did understand the vision, right? So compliance is all about the outcome to the business. It's not a tick in the box. So in the next 29 minutes, I'm going to drive two key messages. One, yes, compliance can be largely automated, be it PCI compliance, be it GDPR, be it 27001, it can be automated, and it can be continuously monitored. So continuous compliance monitoring and compliance automation are the two key messages that I would like to pass. With that, going a bit deeper and talking about the word compliance. So in true sense, what's really compliance? It's all about the controls. You take any framework, again, be it PCI, be it COVID, be it any of the frameworks, eventually compliance is all about control compliance. Now these controls, as you all are aware, are some automated, some are semi-automated, some are manual, preventive, detective. These controls have effectiveness. Some are partially effective, some are ineffective. So these are different control dynamics. But eventually, we're talking about control compliance. So CSOC or CyberSOC is that capability of an organization or a function that, in true sense, helps to institutionalize these controls within the organization and thereafter helps in continuously monitoring them. So the assurance that is required to the stakeholders is what a CSOC would provide. Before I go further deep in the presentation, just want to understand folks here from cybersecurity background, SOC background, PCI DSS background? None? Okay. The reason why I asked this, so when I'm talking through, I'll try and keep the presentation to the context here in terms of the audience. If I go a bit too technical, you can pull me back. But I'm trying to walk you through how typically on the floor in the CSOC we run the compliance. Great. So typically a CSOC or a cybersecurity operations center, you may have these days, seen, heard terms like AI, cognitive cybersecurity, machine learning, deep learning. Eventually, we're talking about a threat detection capability that is less reliant on rules and signatures, and it's more on anomaly detection. Right. So today in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the PCI compliance-related threat detection capabilities. And I'm going to keep it simple. This presentation is made with the basis that this CSOC is all about signature-based threat detection capabilities. Wherever relevant, I'll throw in some examples. But the assumption here is this is a CSOC that is signature-based, rule-based, and it can institutionalize the compliance requirements for PCI DSS and thereafter also help in continuously monitoring. So typically in a cyber SOC, there are 4 or 5 key areas that we look at. First, assurance. So assurance in terms of cybersecurity. So the vulnerability management programs, the pen tests, the security assessments, that's the assurance side of it. Then in compliance, compliance to the technical compliance, the standards, the minimum security baselines, NIST, the CIS, benchmarks, automating those. Third area is access-related assurance or access control-related assurance. Third area could be data integrity or data-related assurance in terms of data security, right? So basically, a CSOC provides that threat detection capability to the organization. Depends upon how it's configured. It's a capability comprising of people, process, and technology. So with that, let's take up the first requirement. It's all about firewalls. So when I talk about firewalls, and so there are 2 parts to it. First, it's the engineering side, which is our cybersecurity engineering folks who help us to map the current controls or the relevant controls to ensure or the coverage for the PCI compliance. And second is the operations team on the SOC that's focused more on running and continuously providing the assurance. So in this case, typically for us, the challenge that we face is, okay, firewalls are in place for the perimeter as well as for the inside. Great. These firewalls definitely have to be configured, hardened, and they have to be placed in the right sense on the network. So hardening, configuring them in the right way, positioning them on the network is the first challenge that we have. Because if these firewalls are not configured the way it should be, if the rule sets are not written the way it should be, we would miss out. There would be noise, right? That's the first challenge. Once the engineering folks have done that, it's deployed, it's in production now, great. Then the ops team, which is basically where the monitoring starts. Now these firewalls, as you're all aware, generate log-based data, okay, access, rules, plain text communication if it's going on can be detected. They generate log-based data, but that is not enough. There have been incidents where firewall, actually a tier 1 product, bypassed. Nothing was logged on the firewall. But thankfully, because we had a packet interception in line between the firewall and the core switch, we could have the packets, we could see the packets there, but the attack was not seen on the firewall. So what I'm trying to say is the placement, configuration of the firewall and the firewall by itself is just not enough. Okay, that's a second challenge. When I talk about firewalls, the deep packet inspection capabilities, which are coming out of the data coming out of the firewall, have to be thoroughly analyzed. So on the SOC, so if I were to demonstrate a compliance to the requirement 1, I would have the firewall placed right, configured, hardened right, continuously assessed for compliance. Thereafter, the data coming out of the firewall has to be analyzed either through log-based mechanisms or through anomaly-based mechanisms. And as we could also have firewalls on other than the perimeter, we could have host-based firewalls. So in this way, we can demonstrate compliance to requirement 1 on a continuous basis. Requirement number 2, about defaults, right? So as the standard says, we got to take out the user account defaults, the password defaults, the configuration defaults, right? And then ensure that we harden these devices. So what we do is any of these compliance monitoring and configuration tools could be a product like a Tripwire, or could be an SS compliance manager. We make sure that these devices are hardened, okay? And that's, again, what I said in the beginning. It's all about the compliance assurance that we need. So for requirement number 2, first is, as I said, removing the defaults, removing the configurations, default configurations. This includes for all the perimeter and network devices, as well as the core infrastructure components in the CDE. Thereafter, once these defaults are basically removed and these devices basically operate the way they are supposed to operate, the other challenge that we face is shared hosting setups, right? Where we have a SOC that's running, the devices managed by us, or the devices which are owned by us in the CDE, great, but then there's a challenge when we have devices which are hosted, or the infra that is hosted by third parties, okay? In that scenario, it becomes a bit tricky, okay? Sharing of logs is a challenge. The flexibility that we need is a challenge. So then we have to think through alternate mitigating controls. We had a scenario where we wanted some web server logs from a hosting company, and they would refuse to give it. And then we have to work around it by putting in Cloudflare and then managing those reports rather than the logs. So typically for us, when it's a shared services provider, that is where a challenge that comes in terms of exchange of data. Third requirement about cardholder data. So data in rest and data in motion. So I'm going to talk about now data in rest, right? Another challenge for the engineering team is if it's a structured data, great, available in databases, applications, you can put a DAM solution, DAM solution, and which is database activity monitoring, and you can get in the logs. The real challenge starts when this data is unstructured, files, Excels, okay, documents which are basically lying on the network, okay. So how comprehensively have we cataloged this information is the second challenge, right? And there is no clear-cut answer to it. So what we have to do is then, in that case, okay, all the structured data that's available in the databases, we can put some sort of monitoring around it. But then for the unstructured data, we have to really scan the network, put some inline tools in place, inspect the packet, look for patterns, and try as much as possible and inventory this unstructured information, including key management or including keys, which is also an issue that we have seen in most of the clients where we work. So typically, the data in storage, unstructured data, is something that is a challenge for us, and we have to continuously run these scanners to see is there anything on the network that we have not cataloged, right? So just a quick recap, firewalls, defaults, data in rest. Requirement number 4, transmission, right? That's about data in motion, okay? And as I mentioned previously, the structured data, not a problem, easy to manage. But now data in motion, again, when it's being transmitted, unstructured data, that's typically where we need to put in controls for or on the channel. Typically, we got to put in controls such as DLP, DRM, or digital rights management, data leakage protection. We may have to put in mechanisms to intercept the core switch and the firewall traffic, so that even by mistake, unstructured data does not go out of the network, and it can result in a potential breach, okay? And particularly in case of unstructured data, this data most of the time resides on end user terminals, end user machines, desktops, laptops, right? And I'm talking about some serious data with some serious card information, okay? So these endpoints are also, they are a weakest link, And that is where EDR kind of a solution or endpoint detection and response kind of mechanism does help us. So going for requirement number 5, which is malware. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, from the CSOC, yeah, I can give assurance to the management. We can give assurance to the organization. Firewalls data is well monitored. Traffic is well monitored. Firewalls are hardened. Great. The data in store, we have cataloged. We have invented that. Defaults are taken out. Excellent. The data in transmission, we have secured the channels. We have removed the old encryptions. Perfect. Great. What about the bad guys? Right? This is a nightmare. Even I mentioned this morning, this is a nightmare. Because we are actually literally fighting the unknown. Right? Instances where you may have a dormant threat or a dormant malware that is sitting on the network, and we are not aware about it. It may not be detected by antivirus or anti-malware at times. Okay? It's there, sitting on the network, waiting for a trigger, waiting for the payload to get downloaded. Okay? So in this particular case, suppose if it's a new client or if it's a new setup, I mean, we have entered this client for the first time. We conduct an exercise called malware baselining, which is basically a closest that we could get to 100% assurance that at this point in time, the network, the devices are relatively cleaner, and then any controls that we start and put from this point forward, we can safely assume that the overall network is clean. So malware baselining becomes a first step in engineering, and then they confirm to us, you can start your anti-malware, antivirus-based monitoring solutions. We already have completed the malware. The another thing that we do also here is put in a sandbox in place in line. So, and this sandbox is pretty much automated. So if the customer wants any malicious files, any malicious attachments, which actually can get parked there, and an image actually of that goes as to the end devices, where actually we try and by design eliminate the attachment. Sometimes this is also done manually by the forensic analyst on the floor. But basically, just to summarize this requirement, baselining, antivirus, anti-malware solutions, sandboxing, EDR are really our friends when it comes to complying to this particular requirement. Going forward, secure DevOps. Okay? So developing and maintaining secure systems and applications. Right? No matter what we do, no matter what we tell the DevOps team, they have their own reasons to do what they do. Okay? Education is extremely important over here. So typically, there are frameworks, there are standards, such as the OWASP, even in PCI DSS, the standards for application security. So education is extremely important. Then some standards are laid for them to undertake the development in that particular manner. So they already obviously eliminate the obvious threats. The OWASP top 10 is taken care of. So then what we get is a reasonably well-coded system that is now good to be tested before it goes into production. So the assurance piece that I mentioned to you, that is what basically kicks in, and we start doing the continuous testing assurance before it moves into production. And once it's in production, that's where the whole game of packet monitoring, data monitoring starts through WAF. Okay, so continuously ensuring that this application, because there will be attacks, and there are attacks. So in this case, WAF helps us to give us continuous assurance against these typical attacks. Now we get into access control, right? So typically, from access control point of view, to comply to these requirements is all about ensuring the logging and the audit trail mechanisms are in place for the CD environment and beyond in terms of access, right? And there could be tons and tons of use cases defined for it. But the focus of this is access control, and this is something that has been done traditionally, and it's something which is very, very easy to achieve. identification and authentication. Great. So now we have to basically look at the traffic or the users who are trying to connect to the system. The trusted users, there are untrusted users, there are privileged users, there are business as usual users, there are third parties, there are remote users trying to come over the VPN. Again, so if we if we do a perimeter right, and if we put in the right access control mechanisms in place, multi-factor authentication in place, and then have the database activity reasonably well monitored, we largely can provide compliance. I mean, we largely can assure of compliance in this particular domain. Okay. Physical access. Now, depending upon the scope of the PCI compliance, or depending upon what's the purpose in the client that's trying, I mean, what's the client's objectives, first and foremost, we would look at, of course, where the data or where the CDE is hosted, right? That's one part of it. The physical controls around that. Okay, the BMS or the building management system, then the integration of that in the SOC, the zoning, the access alarm monitoring, and so on and so forth. Then is the surveillance. Okay, now surveillance can go as advanced as video analytics, or it can remain basic, right? In terms of the access allowed, not allowed, the sensors put in place over there, and those coming into the SOC, including for ATMs and CDM machines. Okay. Then also we got to look at the data that is off-site. We have covered the data center. We have covered the physical premise. But what about the data that is off-site? Again, physical controls and the same amount of physical controls or same type of physical controls that we have looked at in the production side, we also have to start monitoring them in the off-site. Okay. Asset inventory is a very key area for us again over here, because there are times when IT would just come up with assets, not follow the change management process, and we would have a device on the network that we don't recognize. So typically, putting in a NAC or a network access control in place and then continuously monitoring NAC does help a lot. Coming to the end of it, requirement number 10, which is track and monitor. This is pretty much the whole monitoring domain, right? So here I want to highlight particularly how an ideal SOC can be set up, where we integrate third-party feeds or third-party threat feeds particularly, okay? So that these threat feeds give us the appropriate information about bad URLs, bad IPs, the threats that are basically surfacing, and so on and so forth. So other than your usual monitoring, threat feed integration, threat deception capabilities, that we actually have honeypots being placed just before the perimeter of the CDE to basically invite so that we actually can understand the attack pattern and try to understand the attack vectors here. So typically, these are sensors placed. So today we have sensors placed in most of the ISPs in the region, where we try and get this threat data, and based on that, we try and understand the attack surface. So typically for a CSOC, it's just not about relying on the rule-based or the use cases. We also have to get the secondary information. Requirement number 11, something very interesting. No testing is enough. Okay, there is never a state saying, yes, we have tested enough, and the systems are a go. It's a continuous process, as I mentioned. We have to provide continuous assurances. So testing, various types, wireless infrastructure testing around the CDE, the perimeter security testing, the application security testing, the code reviews. So we provide from the CSOC a continuous assurance to ensure that this particular requirement is addressed and the compliance is basically addressed. And I mentioned in the beginning, we need to have a balanced approach between how much we can trust log-based information or the metadata, and how do we use the non-log based, which is actually packets and the actual data on the network, and we'll maintain a fine balance between that. Also, configuration and change management. So typically, we would maybe see a change being introduced in the network, which was not gone through the change management process. And that's where a file integrity monitor or a change control tool for the resources that we have been monitored does help us, and we can provide a reasonable well assurance on this particular requirement. The last requirement, okay, which is in general the information security compliance part of PCI DSS, which broadly covers from a governance perspective all the areas. The key message here is threat modeling, threat management, and risk management. So for that given context, is it a acquirer, is it an issuer, is it a wallet, is it a payment wallet, is it a e-commerce entity? Based on the entity's nature of business and the context, we got to conduct a threat modeling exercise, and based on the threat modeling exercise, identify the prevailing threats that this entity is subjected to, basis which the entire SOC needs to be reorganized to ensure or to provide assurance to those threats that we have identified in the threat modeling. Then we also seriously look at whitelisting, which actually, to a larger extent, tries and eliminate threats and incident response. Yes. The entire game is all about how quickly we identify, we detect, and then, as per the rule book, how do we go about responding to those particular threat events? Okay. So if we are delayed in detection, God help us. Even if we detect early, then how well do we respond is equally important, right? So going back to my point, yes, PCI DSS compliance, or for that matter, any compliance, can be reasonably achieved through automation. To the extent possible, we can automate manual controls. It just needs some creativity, and it's possible. And thereafter, a continuous compliance can be provided. We can undertake continuous compliance and provide that assurance to the stakeholders, okay? And in that way, try and minimize the attack surface. And in this way, we, as a CSOC, can provide value during in the whole PCI compliance landscape. And we have been doing this for the last couple of years, not just PCI DSS, but also for other compliance. It's all about automating and then ensuring that we continuously follow through and make sure that we don't over-rely on A or B piece of technology or a control. There has to be a balance between, or there has to be a fine balance between primary and secondary controls that we put in place. With that, I would like to basically end this presentation with the two messages that I would like you to take away, which are compliance can be automated, and continuous compliance monitoring is something that will give a reasonable comfort level. Yeah, thank you.